know whether I feel better standing up or standing down. I'm going to try and cope without a microphone, because I feel very self-conscious standing about to break into song. If my Scottish accent is too much for any of you, put your hands up and I'll try and talk more slowly. It was quite intimidating coming to speak to this group, frankly, because a lot of my time is spent with people who really don't know anything about the web or social or whatever. But I'm actually, ironically, more comfortable these days with the fact that even people who are involved in it, in this thing, whatever it is, sometimes don't have the time to stop and sort of think about, well, what is this and what is this thing and why is it interesting? And I normally start off just having a little poke at some of the words that we use that are warning signs. And frankly, at risk of being ungracious, one of them is digital. I get slightly worried by people who call it, we have digital this or digital that. And a friend of mine said recently, we'll let you call what we do digital if we get to call the rest of it analog. In the sense that we make it other by calling it digital. I'm also jumpy about the phrase social media because it's been turned into a thing. I took part in Social Media Week last year for the first time and again this year and came away depressed at this industrialization of something that I think is quite personal and about people and connections. And just talking to Sue before we started, I have difficulty with the word media as well, for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, somebody the other day there talked about the social media, and then talked about plural media as if it was just a collection of channels. And I felt very pedantic saying, no, it is a singular phenomenon called social media, whatever. And also the fact that it's tended to be hijacked by marketing people. So, doing a workshop the other day there with a company, trying really hard to get them to think about the use of these platforms internally and being able to use them to make themselves more productive and effective. They kept drifting back into channels and talking at people through these digital media channels. So I'm trying to sort of just get across the idea that I think a lot of this is really covering the fact that in some ways we're getting back to something. I think we're getting back to real connections with real people doing real stuff, albeit in a digital format. And that's kind of what I'm going to touch on through this. A little bit of background. I started blogging 12 years ago while I was working at the BBC, where I had worked for a long time. And I was in charge of a unit basically asked to network people doing interesting things, doing new things. So the prospect of using, in those days it was a basic bulletin board, and then blogs and then wikis, to help people connect to each other, seemed really attractive. I think when I was burdened with the job title of Director of Knowledge Management, people expected me to go out and buy whopping great knowledge repositories. There's a word. Sounds like some medical. Other words around that used to make me wince. We talked about, well, no, I didn't, but people talked about knowledge extraction. Knowledge harvesting was another favourite, which sounds like some cerebral milking machine that you use to suck the good stuff out of staff and leave the empty husks at the back door. And then people wondered why people didn't engage with knowledge management. So at the same time, I was seeing this growth on the web of this connected personal network thing happening. So I thought, we'll have some of that. So we put in a basic bulletin board, £250 worth of software, which over about a 9-year period grew eventually to 25,000 staff using it. I think it's fallen by the wayside these days. Yammer seems to be taking on a life of its own at the BBC. But we just got a long way and put a modest dent in a big organisation very early in using these tools, long before they became known as social media. And we also put in wikis and blogs, as I said, and just the reason I'm showing these two slides is partly pushing back against another aspect of the industrialisation that's happening at the moment, where clients of mine are being put under considerable pressure to spend huge sums of money on things like Jive and Tibber and whatever else, Yammer. Whereas in fact it's still just little boxes, It's little text boxes into which you write something and press save and it goes off and something comes back and you get a reaction to it. And in some ways the essence of the simple tools, I think, is getting lost. We're sort of busying ourselves with over-engineering. It's comfortable because you get back into managing systems, and IT feel comfortable because they've got stuff to do. But it's lost the essence of what we were able to play with. And in fact, it was much easier in those days because nobody had a clue what we were up to. It didn't have a name. We were just tinkering. And again, we were talking about tinkering as being a legitimate and essential characteristic of doing this stuff. But the example there is of our wiki where we developed the BBC's first stab at a social media policy. And just worth touching on that perhaps, because the first thing we did was we had a sort of early Facebook equivalent that allowed us to identify 400 bloggers inside the B. And we basically approached them and said, look, we're going to have some policy, some guidelines. What do you think we should include? They gave us some rough ideas, and we then created a draft straw man that we stuck in the wiki, and then invited them to come and modify a la Wikipedia, change things, add things, whatever. And so we had a really frantic 2 weeks of activity on the wiki, and gradually it slowed down, and it became apparent that we had the basis of our social media policy, which didn't take a single meeting to achieve, which when it was eventually published, people just lined up behind because they'd been part of the process of creating it. And it was, for me, a first glimpse of what I think is still really not being fully grasped in organisations, is that willingness and possibility for people to a high degree self-organise. We're still stuck in a mindset of requiring managers to tell reluctant staff to do things and to then measure them and monitor them once they've started to. This is the beginning of something that I think we're going to see that we'll just gradually just move that to the side and take over from it. I quote this every time, and if you've heard me say it before, apologies, but it's still, I think, worth restating. This is a sentence from the Clue Train Manifesto, which many of you I'm sure will have read. But still, I think, captures what's going on and worth going back to. Globally distributed, near-instant, person-to-person conversations. The fact that you can make connections with and form a relationship with somebody in Iran or China or in some difficult situations behind difficult barriers, or even just the person at the other end of the open plan office who you've never known what they were doing and you've never had the opportunity to sit and chat to them. There are some pretty insurmountable boundaries that we put up inside organisations, never mind between countries, that these tools help us to break down. The near instant aspect of it, I think, is probably the bit that scares most people most, especially those charged with being professional communicators, who are people I speak to a lot, or professional broadcasters. Because we're all finding stuff out for us, or educators. There's another group I was talking to yesterday. Those professions who have taken on the responsibility of communicating for us are bewildered by the fact that we are beginning to relearn to communicate for ourselves. And we're sharing information really quickly. And we're learning out what's going on really quickly and sharing it with each other really quickly. So of course, increasingly the journalists are catching up with events on Twitter or whatever else after they've happened. The education establishments are struggling with how to cope. I was in Latvia yesterday or this morning with a group who were involved in education. And commendably, the European Union is trying to get its head round informal learning, because they're realising that these person-to-person conversations are beginning to generate real learning for people in a way that's currently not recognised or accredited, and in fact possibly disparaged by the official education systems in many countries. So the speed and the apparently unmanaged nature of this challenges people. I'll come back to that. But the reassuring thing is that it is about people. It is about people forming relationships and building trusting relationships. And I still don't tire 12 years on of the power that particularly my blog gives me to form those kind of relationships. The fact that I have good friends who I've known for 12 years, who I've never met, who I know better than people I've worked with for that period of time, people I've lived next. My wife might even say better than her, because we connect differently. You know, the knack of blogging, and I'll come back to this, is that willingness to just open up and share and be thoughtful and notice things. And that can foster, doesn't inevitably, can foster some really powerful relationships. If you believe, as I do, that businesses run on the basis of relationships, that's very strong. Either internally or externally. So I'm working, as was said, with some really interesting organisations and companies who are exploring this possibility of allowing people to begin to foster those kind of relationships, both inside and outside. I was going to take this slide out because I'm going to assume that most of you know what blogs and wikis and whatever else are, but I've decided to keep it in just to allow me to tell a couple of stories. The first one is that I'm using my phone for the screen grabs because most of us these days access most of these tools through mobile devices. But I was working with an insurance company and talked about how naive it was of organisations to ban Facebook. But they're not banning anything because we all access it through our mobile phones. And they confidently said, oh no, we take the phones off them. So I said, bugger working for you then. I mean, it's just really interesting that attitude can be so deep-seated that they would take that move. The first screen grab is of my blog. And really interesting talking earlier about the courage, I guess, it takes to start a blog. And my blog's called The Obvious because it was me overcoming my reticence about stating the obvious. Who am I to say that? Everybody knows this. They'll laugh at me. Which I still feel every time I write a blog post 12 years later. And that thing where you write a blog post that you think is going to change the world and nothing happens. Not a single whisper. Or the other time when I used to drink, when after a couple of bottles too many of red wine, you write something that's complete rubbish and the world goes, oh, that's really interesting. But it's still the thing that has the most impact. It still, for me, builds the best social networks. People connect through that platform are still the most robust. It's the opportunity to have a fixed place on the web. No matter how ephemeral or unpredictable things like Facebook and Twitter are, your blog with your own domain name is your space on the web. There's something to be said for that. And in the work context, something I'm banging on all the time to organisations about is allowing their nerds to blog about what they do. Like, talking to oil companies about allowing their environment nerds to blog internally to begin with, but then visibly externally, ultimately, where they can be seen to be trustworthy, where they can be seen to be knowledgeable. My ultimate fantasy is an organisation where everybody blogs and everybody reads everybody else's blog. And they just gradually accumulate a sense of the organisation, what it's doing and why it's doing it, that they just can't get at the moment. And if you then make that visible, I'll come back to this later, a huge impact potentially on your brand, on a real brand. Obviously the middle one's Facebook, and it is just fascinating however many million, billion that it's now attracting. And the willingness that we have to open up to it. And again, this was funny in the BBC, our internal equivalent, people were very cagey about what they would share. What are they going to do with it? Was a commonly asked question. And yet as soon as they get Facebook, they'll just spray it all over the place and tell everybody everything. And also some of the attitudes that then provokes. You then get people saying, oh gosh, all these people being indiscreet on Facebook. Employers are watching them. Pictures of you being drunk as a student, you won't get a job. I wouldn't employ somebody who hadn't been drunk when they were a student. That's the whole point of being a bloody student. What are they so scared of? So again, it's really interesting how we've got this parallel universe where we're inhabiting this sociable space where we're open and connecting in all sorts of ways, and then we come to work and we're asked to stop that. Which is again, I think, just provoking this questioning of that corporate thing where you put the suit on. And actually, the days when suits used to make you look respectable and trustworthy, they just make you look like a banker nowadays. But it's also helping us to build and foster other forms of trust. So it's interesting in that respect. And then the last one's Twitter, obviously, which, like many of you when I first saw it, I thought I need this like a hole in the head. More people's inane twaddle. But I now couldn't do without it for a couple of reasons. The first, I don't always say this, but with this audience, I'm beginning to think I might be able to do without Twitter because they're hacking me off enough. And app.net, God bless it, might manage to be useful enough to begin to use. But it has been indispensable for a couple of reasons. One is it just filters the web for me. Just cuts out a lot of the noise, allows me to get a higher signal. Actually, it's probably worth saying how you go about that. The numbers can get ridiculous. I mean, there's about 7,500 people follow me on Twitter, and I can't follow 7,500 people back. It's too much noise. I follow about 3,000 because I want them to be able to direct message me, and they can't if I don't follow them. But I only pay attention to 100, and I only use clients that let me only see a list of 100 people. Excuse me, because I don't want more noise than that. But I constantly manage that 100 people. I weed people out if they're adding stuff that's less relevant. Or sometimes if I'm finding I'm in too much of an echo chamber, I'll add people in that are slightly different from me and make me think differently. But I take responsibility for that 100 people. And the effect is, as I say, I get better information faster than most other means available to me. But the other benefit is as a resource. So an example of that, I was doing a webinar with the university in the States a while back, and the software they were using wasn't seeing the camera on my laptop. And so I was looking at the prospect of this room, 200 odd people in America, being faced with a blank screen. And I literally had minutes to go. I was desperately trying to work my way through the help files, nobody on the help desk. So I punted the question into Twitter. And within 10 seconds, I got 4 people who came back with the answer and told me the setting to change on my laptop, and I went on and successfully did the webinar. There's no other way I can imagine having done that. And I could do it because of reciprocity. I could do it because of the fact that enough people had got enough value out of my tweets that they had decided to follow me and were there when I asked the question. And again, I think that's something really key to making use of these tools internally within work, is building up that sense of collective responsibility, that sense of reciprocity, being willing to help and share with each other. But actually, a brief anecdote going backwards, talking to somebody earlier, we were talking about knowledge management and the whole knowledge is power thing, which used to mean that holding on to knowledge made you powerful. Whereas increasingly, if you're not giving it out, people can't see that you've got it. What's the point of having it? And that thing about willingness to share, there was a guy on our forum at the Beeb, by the time it got big, one day posted a program idea. And there was this kind of collective intake of breath, because people thought, this is mad, a program idea is the sort of thing that will make you famous and wealthy, and here's this guy giving it away. And somebody said, you're mad, sharing that on this open forum. But somebody else quickly came back and said, no, he's not mad, because he's just said it's his idea in front of 25,000 people. So that was quite an interesting reversal. The ownership and claiming ownership by sharing it is actually a really powerful thing to do. A lot of this is just driven by being interested. We were talking earlier about being curious. So I'll stop doing this anyway. Is being curious about stuff. Like, oh, that's interesting. And once you have a blog, you start to notice more. Because you have somewhere to write, even if nobody's going to read it, you've got somewhere to put your stuff once you've noticed it. So you start to be more thoughtful. And you'll be out in the world noticing, oh, that's interesting, I might blog about that. Why am I blogging about it? What am I wanting to say? What do I want people's reactions to be? What will I do when their reactions are adverse or whatever? It just gets you into this interesting chain of thought. And then if you do a good post, hopefully other people go, oh, that is interesting. And they'll point to it, or they'll comment on it, or they'll react to it. And that collective process of going, oh, that's interesting, is why this is powerful. And it's like lobbing a pebble into a pond. You get better at lobbing bigger pebbles into bigger ponds and causing bigger ripples. And again, I think that is potentially another way of beginning to run businesses. Networks of people, noticing things going wrong, noticing things going right, setting ripples off into a network of people inside their organisation rather than having to heave something up and then back down another chain in the silo. Sadly being corrupted by the like button and the Google Plus button, but a lot of this is driven by the hyperlink, is the ability to point to things, which again gets buried under all the complexity of technology. But it's literally that ability to be able to say, that's a good article, or this is what we did the last time, or there's the policy that you should read, or this person is trustworthy. And that, finding something interesting and then being able to point to it, is what's important about these tools. And then, you add in things like RSS, and it's funny watching the fortunes of RSS, if you like. For those of you who, I'm sure most of you do, but if you don't, RSS stands for Really Simple Syndication. It's the mechanism that allows one to subscribe to content, either into something like Paperly or Google Reader or some form of aggregation that pulls the various sources into one place. It's what drives or enables podcasting. When Dave Weiner worked out how to put audio into the RSS feed. But again, it's the fact that I can assemble my own information environment. I choose what sources are in my RSS feeds. And like my Twitter followers, I manage what's in there so that it's adding value and not causing too much stress or too much noise. But it's an active use of information. It's me making choices about information rather than relying on professionals to pump information at me down channels. I'm assembling my own networks. And obviously with things like hashtags, it's probably worth telling the story because a friend of mine, Chris Messina, who came up with the idea for the hashtag about 5-6 years ago, because in the early days when Twitter started, it literally just had the blank 140 characters. So even the @ sign was a convention that users we adopted to identify posts as being for somebody, that Twitter eventually incorporated into the platform. Hashtags were the same. Chris just said one day, what if we tag things? And we could use the pound sign to identify a tag. And I asked him the other day, I said, how do you feel now that it's on hoardings on motorways and adverts and the lower third captions on Strictly Come Dancing? It's quite remarkable where that's gone. But again, it's just really interesting because it's a very ephemeral, very user-driven way of assigning meaning or importance. And the way people now chase being the trending hashtag on Twitter, game it, pay money to get it, and all this sort of stuff. I think it's just really interesting how we've kind of created that power for ourselves with the tools. And going back to the sort of theme, it is a deindustrialization of things. My daughter was studying the Industrial Revolution the other day there at school, and pre-industrial revolution. And she said, more people used to work in the old days like you do, didn't they, Daddy? In other words, freelance, artisan, travelling, working with other people in small groups or whatever. And I think that the professionalisation of roles, we've outsourced our communication to professional communicators. We've outsourced our caring about people to professional HR managers, How well has that gone? And some of this is about us taking that back, and we've outsourced our meaning making, our storytelling to the media. And I think I've suffered in the process, and I now feel guilty for my time in the media, because we lost in some cases our confidence, we lost our ability to tell our own stories. This is partly why we're so reticent about such a basic, simple thing as blogging. Who are you to say that? You're not a professional, you're not supported by this edifice. And it is about finding our voice. You know, back in the early days of blogging, this was the kind of cliche which we used to describe just working out how to say what you wanted to say, finding the confidence. And you would eventually find a way that you felt comfortable with writing on your blog, and a way that was authentic for you. If you like. I think authenticity was another word that was bandied around. And I think this is what people are beginning to find in the workplace. The confidence, the means, the willingness to say what they think. And sometimes it's not trivial. You know, I'm coaching some people, some quite senior people who are beginning to do it. And it's really interesting talking to guys who are, you know, no spring chickens, senior people, not wussies, you know, prepared to take risks, getting their knickers in a twist about writing a blog post. Because they're being required to say what they think in public, in writing. And I remember watching the director of HR at the time in the BBC doing a live chat on our internal bulletin board. And so there was a 4 or 5 computers where people could see incoming questions from about 5,000 staff who were taking part. And Stephen would watch these questions coming in, go into a huddle with the other senior managers and work out what they could or couldn't answer and how they were going to answer it. And then he would voice an answer, which some poor secretary would type up and press save, and then he would argue with how she'd interpreted what he said. And I'm watching all this happen and thinking, that says it, this has got all of it in there, hasn't it? Because it's this guy who's in a position of authority, who's used to having things fact-checked and signed off by various people before it goes out, having to take part in what's effectively a chatty, sociable, people type situation in writing. And it was non-trivial to try and do that. I was a bit mischievous the other day. I was working with a consulting firm who have a caption or a slogan that says that they're thought leaders. And I said, how can you be thought leaders when nobody knows what you think? And again, I think this, I mean it, you know, it's really hard to know what big organisations think collectively and what they're about. And it's hard to know what people within those organisations think. And taking the time to think, as I mentioned earlier, is not easy. You know, one of the advantages of blogging is that you have a reason to stop and think, you know, what was that day about? What was that week about? What were the things that were interesting enough to write about? And having that is of real value if you're busy, pressured in any role in any organisation. Having the time to think, why am I doing this, is worthwhile. And then David Weinberger in the early days of blogging called this writing ourselves into existence, which I always liked. And again, it's this idea of, you know, thinking hard about why you do what you do, punting it out into the world, and then having it come back, either reinforced or disagreed with or ignored. But there's almost something existential about that, something therapeutic about that, about just having this network way of thinking and working. And of course, one of the prospects is that you leave a trace. You know, one of the big reasons for knowledge management, or the justification was of capturing knowledge, was to prevent knowledge leaving an organisation when they left. That's just reminded me. I actually eventually got made redundant from the BBC, which is no advert for getting involved in this stuff. But although I was pleased to go, but about a month before I left, I was asked to take part in a senior level meeting to discuss how to prevent knowledge leaving the organisation. You couldn't make it up, could you really? But as I said, I've left more of a trace than most. But all the blog posts, all the wiki posts, all the forum posts that I've done over the 6 or 7 years that we've been active, we're still there. We're still linkable to. So if any of it had been worthwhile, it was still findable. Unlike the very few documents that I wrote that were stored expensively in some knowledge repository. Never, in fact, PwC call their knowledge repositories knowledge coffins because it's where knowledge goes to die. Networks of people thinking in a connected way and leaving a trace has a personal value or benefit, but obviously an organisational one. And once you have these, people then get jumpy. Once it's all taking off and you've got people very active, people want to tidy it up. And one of my big regrets was that I felt, our initial bulletin board grew like Topsy and was messy. And I loved the messiness because the messiness was navigable. But we then changed the tools, it was more visible, and I had more senior people on my back telling us to tidy it up. So we tidied it up, and I think it lost an awful lot in the process. It became more sanitized. And I became aware that we were sort of watching the equivalent of Cotswold villages as this is Broadway, that grow up over centuries, haphazardly, with nobody predetermining the architectural style. But it sort of works, you know, with the churches and with the pub, there's lots of well-worn paths between them that you're comfortable to stand on a street corner and chat. Most corporate IT environments are like Milton Keynes. You know, efficient on the face of it with lots of straight roads and roundabouts. But I get lost every time I'm at Milton Keynes, even with a sat-nav. Because I can't relate to it. I can't map the values to it that other people can. So again, there's this part, you know, it doesn't mean you throw out all your formal systems, but I think you have to allow the Cotswold villages to emerge alongside them. And a lot of it's around signal to noise. You know, if we've got too good at tidying up. You know, a lot of it management is making things tidy and organised. And the problem is that in trying to cut out the noise, we've cut out the signal. So we're not saying an awful lot. And I think, possibly provocatively, the way that we need to get over that is to have more crap. You know, there's lots and lots of crap on the internet, but that's partly how the internet works, because it allows stuff to happen. And we get to decide what's crap and what's not crap. Inside an organisation, you have to let more people talk crap. Because if you don't, you just sanitise it all and you close it back down again, and people go, oh, I'm not saying that because somebody think it's crap. So they never get to say it. So really tough cultural changes in some of this, which you can't achieve in one go. And this is partly, again, my nervousness about the big platforms that have initiatives and lots of pressure. This isn't original to me. There was an academic who came up with the phrase Trojan mice, which I loved as an idea to describe little, unobtrusive, inexpensive things that go off and find their own way, but that you're reasonably confident will eventually get somewhere worthwhile and join up. And I still think that that's the way you get this stuff to happen in most organisations. Not having a big initiative, but having a kind of start-up entrepreneurial mentality where you fund small things and see where they go. And another aphorism was from the US Marines that we actually began to jokingly adopt in my team, which is keep moving, stay in touch, and head for the high ground. Which, as I say in my book, is about as strategic as I think you can get with this. And be strategically tactical. You know, work out roughly where the high ground is. Keep doing stuff and keep talking to each other while you're doing it. A lot of companies are getting into this particular moment. They're aspiring to be down with the kids externally and paying social media agencies to do all this. But then it hits the inside where they're not even 1.0 and they don't know what to do with it. So all these connections and all these potential conversations get lost when it hits the inside of the organisation. You get situations where, you know, people wait a day and a half to get a blog post signed off. You know, they're not allowed to tweet until half a dozen managers have checked that it's okay. Which just doesn't work. And then if they're lucky, they get to release 140 character press releases. You know, this nonsense on Twitter where you get, I just don't follow companies on principle. But when you get a company that talks in this kind of form and then wants to be my friend, it doesn't make any sense. And a lot of them trying to do this end up looking like your dad dancing a disco. Where you're proud of him for having a go, but you'd really rather he stopped. And that's where I think a lot of corporations are at the moment. It's not right. And they're also facing the fact that the inside is becoming the outside, going back to the people with the mobile phones. You know, all of your staff are on the internet, they're all on Facebook. Are they or aren't they allowed to talk about work? Do they or don't they have to pretend that they don't work somewhere that they do? I think that's getting very grey, it's getting very confused. It's difficult for the individuals, it's difficult for the organisations. You're expected to be at work 24/7 because you're on the web and they're giving you internet access to your email. How does that mean your relationship with them has changed? And then ultimately this is a consequence for brand. You know, people still protect these shiny, perfect brands that actually just mean we don't trust them. increasingly it makes us suspicious of them. Whereas allowing your staff to become your advocates, to be enthusiastic about working with you, and if they're not enthusiastic at working for you, you've got problems anyway. But in fact, that's reminding me of another great saying. Dave Weiner, the guy who invented RSS, once said, if you don't want me to slag off your product on the internet, don't have a shit product. Which is brutal, but I think really where we're getting to, where a lot of the squeamishness around this is that a lot of companies are kind of uncomfortable about what they do. So a last story to kind of sum all this up, and this is a personal one, but I have a crumpler bag that I use to travel around the world with. And it's got a very thick strap which I lengthen to cope with my long body. And I couldn't work out how to relace it. So I'm flapping my way around the world's airports, annoying other passengers with this thing, and occasionally sitting down trying to work it out. And then a couple of years ago, somebody from Crumpler UK started following me on Twitter for reasons better known to themselves. And so I said, well, seeing as you're there, can you tell me how to relace my bag strap? So whoever it was made a brave attempt in 140 characters. Predictably failed miserably. So I went back and said, sorry, none the wiser. So they said, okay, give me an hour or so. And an hour or so later, I got a direct message with a link to a Flickr sequence of 6 photographs showing me the different steps that it took to relace my bag strap. So I'm well chuffed that somebody in an organisation was listening. They were willing to try to help me. They were willing to have a second attempt when the first attempt didn't work. And I still get a reasonable amount of traffic on my blog for that story, for people still looking how to relace. But I then, a few months later, the zip went. So I went back looking for my mate, Crumpler, and got no response. So whether they'd been sacked for using Twitter at work, or moved on, or whatever, the point of the story, or the kick in the tail, is that I had some sense of relationship with that organisation. I had some very modest sense of connection and obligation with them, which then felt let down, which I felt resentful about. So it's kind of this rocky thing between thinking, gosh, here's a company connected with me as a customer in a genuine and authentic way, and it's helpful. Oh, but I've got bored with doing that. So again, I think companies that get involved with this have to stay in it for the long haul and work out how to do it. My squishiest slide of the lot, and again, this is David Weinberg. He once said that what makes the internet hang together isn't IP, it's not internet protocol, it's love. It's the very basic human desire to connect with each other. This is why Facebook likes matter beyond what they should. It's why writing a blog post and nobody listening to it matters more than maybe it should. But it's what we're kind of reaching out for. And it's also what I think is possibly what we want from our organisations. You know, at the best, when I was in it, the Beeb was a passionate organisation of people who cared about what they did. And occasionally it got to giddy heights by mustering that appropriately. And I get sad when I talk to people who just don't care that much about their work, or they're not that bothered, or they're not that passionate, or they're apologetic. You know, I was doing something with a Danish brick company, boy do I get about a Danish brick company, who were saying, well, who would read our blog? You know, nobody's interested in bricks. And I said, well, actually, I'm building a conservatory at the moment, and I want to find some genuine brick nerds, because all I'm getting is fluff and marketing stuff on the internet. So, you know, I think actually a lot of this is about passion, it's about caring, it's about vulnerability and being willing to open up. And basically, you know, we were saying earlier, I genuinely think it's the equivalent of the printing press. And we're at the very, very start of something that's going to take decades. We won't really know where this is going for another 50 years or so. And I got involved in it 12 years ago because I was aware that my kids would inhabit this virtual world even more than I have. And if it was going to be habitable, I had to make it habitable by being in there. So that's the opportunity, I think, that we've all been presented with. So I'll stop talking. Thank you very much.